12 tone. Do you ever get bored with traditional harmony? Do you ever feel like everything has already been done and you're not quite sure how you would top a Mahler symphony or a Strauss opera? I imagine this is what Schoenberg was thinking when he was coming up with his 12 tone system. Most music that people enjoy is based on the system of tonality. Put simply, tonality is the arrangement of musical notes into keys and hierarchies. Within these keys, each note and chord has a function, and the goal of tonality is to create tension and release through this harmonic structure. In other words, some notes and chords are more important than others, and there is always a note that serves as the tonic, or the home note. This is where the music feels most at rest. Schoenberg's 12-tone system was a constraint that he placed upon himself that would allow him to break free of the traditional routes of harmony and tonality, and explore new ideas of emancipated dissonance, or dissonance and consonance for its own sake and not to serve the goals of tonality. At the end of the video, we're going to put Schoenberg's method to the test, and I will compose a piece using his 12-tone method. What is 12-tone? 12-tone, put simply, is a system that attempts to completely avoid the thought of any one note being more important than the other. This is accomplished by creating a system that does not allow you to repeat any one note again before all 12 of the chromatic pitches have been played. Every note in the chromatic scale has to happen before any note can be played twice, which heavily muddies the ear's sense of what the tonic or the home note is. In 12-tone music, each of the pitches are assigned a number. In this case, we'll say that C equals 0. Any note could be assigned 0 as long as the relationships to the other notes are correct. Every other note is assigned a number based on the number of half steps it is away from C. D flat would be 1, D would be 2, etc. So a chromatic scale starting on C would look like this. In this system, enharmonicism doesn't make a difference. G sharp is 9, whether it's written G sharp or... In order to compose a 12-tone composition, we must first derive a tone row. A tone row is just a string of these 12 pitches in a unique order, with the caveat being that each pitch must be used at least once and none of them can be repeated. So the row that we'll use is this. So for our composition, we have to use all of these notes in that order before repeating any notes. What happens when you want to use notes in different orders? It would get boring pretty quick if you just had to use that one row in that order over and over again. Well, there are operations that you can put the row through to help create some more intrigue. The first operation is known as transposition. We can transpose the row to a new pitch level, so all of the notes will change, but the intervals between the notes will stay the same. For example, our row, if transposed up by one half step, would become... We can also call this version of our row T1, or transposition 1, with the original row being named T0. We can transpose the row by any interval that we like. We could retrograde the row, which simply means to play it backwards. So our T0 will become... and we can label this R0. The retrograde can also be combined with our transposition, like so. Remember, our T1 row was... and if we want to retrograde that row, we would get... This row would be labeled R1. We can invert the row, which means to flip the row over the axis of 0 and 6. Here's a graphic of this. You know you are doing this right if both numbers add up to 12, with the exception of 0. 0 equals 0, 1 equals 11, 2 equals 10, 3 equals 9, 4 equals 8, 5 equals 7, and 6 equals 6, and so on and so forth. So our row goes from this to this. This will be labeled I0, or inversion 0. This can also be transposed up and down as many half steps as you would like. The inversion can also be retrograded and transposed, which opens up even more possibilities. The retrograde inversion, RI0, would look like this. The matrix. Instead of trying to escape it, in this music, we embrace the matrix. It can be a godsend for figuring out all the possibilities of the tone row. The matrix is a way of showing every possible operation of the row and all of its forms. This way shows us the transpositions, this way shows us the retrograde transpositions, this way shows the inversions, and this way shows the retrograde inversions. So let's use some of this info and write a short 12-tone piece. My piece will be 2 voices, and the voices will be doing this. Voice 1 will play a theme of T0, and voice 2 will rest. And then voice 2 will take over T0, and voice 1 will play I4, and will continue in a canonic structure. I'll treat each row as a theme, so when T0 is played in the first voice, it will be repeated identically in the second voice. And that's mostly what you get.
Until the 20th century, the timeline of classical music history was more or less a straight line, a series of relatively consistent and coherent approaches one after another. Classical music in the 20th century was more like a complicated game of Tetris, a bunch of interlocking and overlapping pieces. Most music histories mark the end of Romanticism and the start of modernism as happening sometime in the early years of the 20th century, but it's a period that becomes much harder to pin things down into any one style. And this is a trend that only seems to exacerbate as the century progresses. Let's start with some of the broader trends. You have the tail end of Romanticism, which never fully dies as a means of expression throughout the century. You have Expressionism, atonality, serialism, you have neoclassicism, modality, the rise and influence of folk and world music, the dawn of the electronic age, American experimentalism. Later in the century you have minimalism, new complexity, spectralism, postmodernism, postminimalism, neo-romanticism, and by the 21st century the age of isms seems largely to have broken down and we're left with Wagner. Only 13 years later Schoenberg's style had moved on to sound like this. This is Pierrot Lunaire, Schoenberg's first expressionistic masterpiece, which pioneered both that weird semi-sung style known as Sprechstimme, as well as the small mixed ensemble which would become a central part of 20th century music. Schoenberg sought ways to break free of the harmonic approaches of the 19th century, developing ways of writing atonally, music without a tonal centre, and eventually developing the famous 12-tone approach in which all notes of the scale were treated equally. He was followed in this by his two pupils, Alban Berg and Anton Webern. The three together became known as the Second Viennese School, drawing a somewhat grandiose equivalence to the First Viennese School of Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven. Berg's expressionist operas Wozzeck and later Lulu are thorny on first hearing, but are both rich with passion, humour and horror, and are key operatic works of the century. Webern condensed the 12-tone style to the other extreme, making really short fragmentary pieces, which in their quiet way are as passionate and intense as anything by Mahler. Igor Stravinsky is one of the giants of 20th century music, and he was constantly on the lookout for new sources of inspiration, whether it was the Russian folk music of his early masterpieces like The Firebird, Petrushka and The Rite of Spring, the classical masters during his neoclassical period, or 12-tone technique in his later period. Whether because of these influences or just his own huge talent, Stravinsky revitalised approaches to rhythm and harmony, and he's a figure as central to classical music in the 20th century as Picasso is to the art world. The Second World War seems to have had an effect on composers that can hardly be overstated, causing many to feel the need for a clean slate and a rebuilding of the musical languages from scratch. The fact that Olivier Messiaen managed to write his profoundly moving Quartet for the End of Time whilst a prisoner in a German prisoner of war camp remains one of the most shockingly impressive feats of human willpower. Messiaen went on to develop another highly individual style which mixed lush, hypersweet tunes with twittering bird calls, and a bold formal approach that eschewed transitions in favour of big building blocks of colour. Messiaen was in peak Boule, as was probably Le Morte sans Maître from 1955, a sort of mid-century riposte to Schoenberg's Pierrot, and a dazzlingly original sound world. Stockhausen's experimentalism saw him take in a huge range of approaches, from the three orchestras of Gruppen to the electronic work Gesang der Junglinge. And the influence of early experiments into the new medium of electronic music affected many of this generation. György Ligeti took electronic sounding effects and brought them into the orchestral world, along with a sharp sense of humour and a fine ear for colour. And Xenakis reimagined architectural ideas in oral form. But eventually the leaders of this avant-garde found their certainties gradually fading.